Okay, so we're going to switch away from romantic relationships to parenting. And I mean, parenting still represents an important part of one's life, again, for those people who are parents. But we're going to be talking about people who are parenting adult children. So just basically in midlife or older, and if you have children, those children are grown. What does that mean for you? What does that mean for your overall well-being? And we've already talked about some of these ideas before. One of the ideas is that as a whole, we know that people who are in midlife or older are spending more time with their emerging adult children than in generations past. So, in generations past, it was more likely to be the case that once somebody, let's say, left home to go to college, then they kind of stayed away. Not to say that everybody went to college, and not to say that everybody is like totally distancing themselves where, they're not talking to mom and dad or anything like that, but it's just kind of leading more separate lives. We talked about with emerging adulthood where it's more likely to be the case that you move back in with parents at least once, or maybe even longer into your 20s. And so it's quite different to look at parenting adult children today than in a decade ago, 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago. Parents are giving more support, and support can be both emotional and or financial to their adult, and again, adult is just a label, but they're adult children. And sometimes that can bring issues into their romantic relationships. So, if two partners are arguing about how much financial or emotional support should be given to children who are, actually adult children, and I have this question here of like how much support is normal, and this could be both emotional or financial, and or what are factors that are associated with this help in contact. And the research by and large hasn't fully addressed these questions. Like I mean we've attempted to answer these questions. I've attempted to answer these questions even in my own research. How much support is too much? But really, there are so many different factors at play that it's hard to answer that question. I mean, we don't necessarily want parents to be enablers where children don't, and adult children is what I mean here, don't develop autonomy and the ability to go out and do things on their own and, are kind of stuck. But the range of normal is quite substantial. Like it's quite varied. Part of that is because that it's more accepted now that people are, staying at home or relying on parents than before. So if it's more normalized, both the adult children and the parents are going to have less negative attitudes towards it because it's more normalized. What are some factors that are associated with help and contact? One thing is, culture for sure. And I just have, for some cultures, let's say Asian broadly or Latin American broadly, cultures are cultures that are more likely to put family first. So like no matter what, like you help your family out and whoever needs help. And if that's the case, then family members are likely to reach out and take care of each other no matter what. Does that mean that it doesn't come with any stress? No, not necessarily, but it's just something that you do. When we talk about parenting adult children, it's, the stressors might not just be emotional or financial. The stressors may come from just these expectations that we have for our children. And, as a whole, parents just say that they want what's best for their child and they want their child to grow and perhaps be more than they were or what they could achieve. And so there's research that shows that middle-aged parents in particular may feel some stress, and also their well-being might be affected if they see their child is not meeting these life goals or these achievements or maybe what they're capable of. And those goals can be broad. So like if they, worry about their child because their child can't find a job that is good or good enough, perhaps they're struggling in relationship domains. Perhaps they're struggling in financial domains. Perhaps they're struggling. parents are worried that their child isn't becoming a parent. So it seems like a delay in the normal life trajectory. Are some of these concerns sometimes unwarranted? Of course, right? There are parents who put these, I don't know, unwarranted, um, I don't know, goals on their children that aren't necessarily either achievable and or maybe not realistic for that particular child. But oftentimes it's just these goals are representing societal goals or of expectations for people who are adults making the transition to adulthood. Nevertheless, like parents do report feeling stressed about these things. And so stress, they say that parenting never isn't stressful. Again, doesn't matter if you have a newborn or a 50-year-old child, that those stressors remain. They might look different over time, and there are times where parenting's harder than other times, but that stress is sometimes just like always present. Depending on when somebody has children, and when their children obviously have children, is going to affect when they become a grandparent. So that's our next topic. We see that when somebody becomes a grandparent for the first time, not for all grandchildren, is usually in one's late 40s or early 50s. And you can think about your own grandparents right now, whether they are living or no longer living. But when did they first become a grandparent? And many of them will fall into this age range. So one of the interesting findings, though, or just maybe not even a finding, but realization, is that grandparents are living longer. We're all living longer. And so, when we think about the whole overall lifespan, when somebody becomes a grandparent in their late 40s or early 50s, they're actually spending more time of their life as grandparents. And so when you look at, again, starting with early or late 40s or early 50s, that means that if they're living, into their 80s, 90s, that about a third of their life is spent as grandparents. That is quite substantial. It's a long time to be a grandparent. I think about I only have one grandma who's still alive, and I'm really close to her, but she is a great, great grandma. Just because of how, some of she had children younger, and then some of her children had children younger, and so on. I'm a weird one in having a child older, but that's a long time as a grandparent. Now, there are some interesting differences between those who become grandparents really early on. So, I mean, you can even become, I heard a story of a time of like a grandma who was like 28. So she had a child young, and then her child had a child young. But people who become grandparents really early on are saying that life might be more challenging. And I don't mean just a 28-year-old. I think even like in late 30s and 40s too. And part of that is because just like any other time in our life, if we're balancing more roles and our hands are in more buckets, then it's more challenging to us. There's more stress. So for some, an early grandparent may be still working, right? They might still have children of their own at home. So they might still have a 4-year-old, and then their older child had a kid. Thinking back to my grandma, now the times were different back in the 30s when my grandma was born, but my grandma had an older sister who actually had a child before my grandma was born. So my grandma has a niece that's older than she is, only by 6 months, and they're actually really close, more like sisters. But again, if parents are balancing all of these things and then they become grandparents, that's just more stress on their shoulders, and therefore that could be challenging. I just wanted to touch a little bit upon grandparent involvement. So some of you have grandparents that have been involved or were involved, depending if they're still living, in your life quite substantially, and have played a huge role in developing you and shaping you, and just being there for you as part of your social network and social support system. For others of you, grandparents may not have been alive, or lived somewhere else, or there were various barriers to hanging out with them and getting to know them. Relationships are really complicated. But when we look at the effects of having grandparents involved in your life, that generally is pretty positive. And the effects are bidirectional. So what this means is that the involvement is helping the children, the grandchildren, but it's also helping the grandparents in various ways. So, research suggests that having involved grandparents has been associated with both positive child and adolescent outcomes. This is broad, but just in general, having grandparents around and having that social support has been shown to be linked with cognitive outcomes and social outcomes and positive emotional outcomes. So, as a whole, really positive. Grandparents also are reporting and experiencing more life satisfaction when they're involved. This is a positive thing. They report having more opportunities to kind of nurture the new generation, which is something that is really important. When we talked about Erickson, this idea of generativity making a difference in the world. It often makes them feel younger, maybe not moment by moment, but overall. And it gives them a chance to pass down those traditions, which we kind of talked about when we talked about social transitions in adolescence, that older generations, and as part of this social redefinition time, are passing down this information. So this bidirectional means that our involvement is affecting positively for most families, or many families, both the grandchildren and the grandparents. I'm going to talk more about grandparenthood on the next slide. In this article, this was not a research-based article in the sense that they did not gather data and or have a have a method section or anything like that. It's a review article or a theoretical article. And so what they were interested in examining is grandparent investment and basically why do grandparents do what they do? And is this something that is, the same that it has been from generations past? Or is the role the role of grandparents changing as we go through time? So, some of the things that they were talking about, though, is that grandparents often invest a lot of resources in their grandkids. This could be both time and money. Obviously, grandparents vary for a lot of reasons. One thing could be proximity if they're close. Obviously, if they're living, that's the number one factor. But some data from the U.S. Census, as reported in 2009, about 2.5 million grandparents in the U.S. provided most of the basic needs. So essentially, like what parents might do, but maybe they can't afford, or there's lots of different life circumstances of one or more of their grandchildren. So that means that there are many, many, many grandparents around the U.S. who are basically supporting their grandchildren. So that's a substantial money or financial investment. When we look at data in Europe, so this is not just an American phenomena, almost 60% of grandmas and 50% of grandpas reported saying like, hey, we're doing a lot of childcare too. I don't know what that number offhand looks like in a US sample. I imagine that it's probably not necessarily all that different. I would imagine the numbers would be lower, but maybe not that different. But during a 12-month period. And so that's a time investment. It might also be a financial investment as well. So essentially, in this article by Cole and Hertwig, is what they were looking at is why do grandparents do that? And this wasn't, where they're collecting data, where they're asking grandparents, why do you do it? But they're suggesting that there are evolutionary and sociological theories that kind of help us understand why grandparents invest all of this time and money. Let's get into that.